Annie Kelly, welcome to the program. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So, your series on QAnon Anonymous Man Clan, for people that haven't checked it out, they really should. It's tremendous. It's both like disturbing and funny because these are very strange characters that I want to ask you about, but also insightful. Uh, Before we get going, I just wanted to ask you, by way of kind of introduction, I mean, what inspired this? Why did you folks want to undertake such an ambitious series on the show?
Yeah, so I did my PhD. Like started that I think in 2016 and finished it in 2020. About, I guess, yeah, what was the popular term for it at the time was the manosphere, which has kind of fallen out of use. It's not a term you hear so much
Mm.
anymore. And I think that's actually because the manosphere is just the sphere. It's just like the general internet now. But at the time that I was studying it, it was still very much its sort of own enclosed space, which was still just kind of just figuring out social media. And the spaces that I looked at were it was two blogs, I think, and a Reddit forum. Um, And so I did my PhD about these spaces, these kind of communities at what I think was quite a pivotal time for the manosphere. It was, I would say, when it was becoming more politicized. The exact period I looked at was 2012 to 2016.
Hmm.
And so this is kind of a real period of, I would say, politicization for the manosphere. Begins exploring like I guess what you'd call a kind of more coherent far-right political ideology, all in the run-up to, I guess, the Trump campaign, and that kind of, yeah, sort of pre-Trump culture war that takes over the internet.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, so that was my PhD, and I then when I finished that, I was, I was like, I've had enough of this. This is such a depressing place. I want to look at something else. And I picked QAnon. And this was partly because I was working for the QAnon Anonymous podcast. And I was becoming really intrigued by what I saw as the kind of momentum of conspiracy movements. But then, yeah, Julian approached me and said that, he had like a little obsession, I think, with the post-manosphere masculinity influences, the influences that were showing up on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and things like this. And yeah, he asked me if I'd like to collaborate on a series. And essentially, yeah, I guess I see it as the sequel to my PhD in some ways, like what happened next.
When I started seeing some of these cretins show up on my TikTok and Instagram, I honestly thought it was just me because I have this like bizarre fascination with these types of creatures. And and then to realize, no, actually Tate is like one of the like most famous people on the internet. That was kind of
Mm.
shocking to me. Um, but for people that aren't as online as me or you or Julian, could you give me like kind of a brief lay of the land? Like, who exactly are the man clan archetypes that are sort of dominating the particular spaces and discourses that you've been looking at?
Yeah, so I guess when I was looking at the manosphere, it was already quite stratified into different tendencies, different approaches. You had, I guess, the more kind of straightforwardly, uh, much more straightforward answers to feminism, called themselves men's rights activists, and kind of viewed themselves, I guess, as the mirror image of the feminist movement in lots of ways. Then you had, I guess, more we call kind of like lifestyle gurus, which I think is the trend that has picked up the most in kind of the contemporary social media manosphere. And these were guys who, uh, yeah, from the very early internet, I think from like even like there were old BBS boards called like seduction and things like that. And the whole idea was that, just like any, just like anything, you could get better at dating, at picking up women, if you learned a few strategies, a few tips and tricks. Um, and this idea, yeah, it's kind of started off, as I say, kind of on the pre-internet. People were like selling courses on how to do this before the internet was ever even
Yeah.
existed.
People probably remember the game and the like all those like
Yeah.
negging and those techniques that, you know, you just go to like any club of that era and then someone you'll see one of those guys. It was kind of in the air.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess from this tendency kind of morphed, I guess, a more holistic ideology. It wasn't simply about, pickup artistry as something you do, but became kind of actually almost like a complete way of looking at the world. And this was called the red pill. The understanding essentially that you were that in learning how to better seduce women, you were also kind of revealing to yourself some hidden truths around the world that women and the feminist establishment and the liberal kind of elite more generally didn't want you to know. And this kind of, I think, sort of politicized element of the manosphere is also something that I think has remained, is a charge that you see in lots of the contemporary influencers today. So, I mean, the whole thing with the influencers is, of course, they all have to have their own gimmick. They have to have their own thing. So some of them will focus more on, I guess, bodybuilding, giving yourself a strong, attractive, manly physique. Others will, focus more on the dating thing. Other things I think other influencers I think often take an approach which I think did exist when I was studying these spheres, but definitely feels much more dominant now, where I guess the kind of red pill attitude is also paired with this kind of very like entrepreneurial kind of mindset.
Right.
About kind of being your own boss and making your own money, which I guess, is a theme that was always there, but I think has become particularly ascendant because I think plays into social media logics quite a lot.
Yeah, it's all about your success and do you have a Bugatti? Because I do,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
And I can't forget the nutrition guys as well.
I was gonna.
Raw meat guys. We
I,
actually started our series with a fascinating character called the Liver King. His whole thing is that you have to eat lots of meat, preferably raw meat, and preferably raw organ meat as well. Liver, obviously, being the best one.
Yeah, those videos where it's like Chef Lionel's here to tell you like what's for dinner, and then you see like a giant plate full of testicles. Like, who is this desirable for?
That's his slogan. Yeah, it's like, who needs vegetables when you have testicles?
Yeah.
Kind of fascinating.
Yeah, this is a part of it. I mean, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised by it because there are these kinds of like fascist, like health nut tendencies in fascism and these kind of like tribal and like these projections of what natural is. That's kind of goes way back. But to see the extent of it, like there's a guy in Vancouver who like is known for like drinking his own piss, and does like masturbation rituals and ceremonies with guys, and like
I know the exact guy you're talking about. Yeah.
Like where do you think this is coming from? Why the kind of like, yeah, you kind of got the like macho woo-woo health influencer, and then you've got the like softer sort of health influencer, but that's like such a dominant current now in the manosphere.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what's so fascinating about the way that the manosphere has moved to the influencer model is it really feels like it's had a creative flourishing in lots of ways, because before these places were always so community based. They were on forums or blogs and with, often with comment sections and things like that. So there was a kind of real social strictness, I think, in how you could express yourself. And I think I in my work, I sort of, found like lots of ways that people would kind of play with this kind of quite oppressive understanding of masculinity, even as, they reasserted it in lots of ways. But I think one thing that's been really interesting about the influencer model is you've seen, as you say, this kind of, this kind of embracing of, I guess, more new age, I would say kind of traditionally feminine ideas. um, and or rather, I guess the kind of the ideas and themes that they're picking up on and evolving for their audience often come from like quite feminine spaces and kind of new age health and nutrition. It's not to say that like there were never men interested in those spaces before, but um, it's interesting kind of seeing those ideas taken and given that kind of manliness, masculinity sheen. Um, but I think there is again a historical current which comes from um, Robert Bly and the mythopoetic men's movement in general,
Hmm.
which was I think like a really curious experiment in yeah, I think creating a well, I mean, the problem with the mythopoetic men's movement is it became so messy because so many people wanted it to be different things. People kind of wanted it to have a sort of political wing. But the idea originally, which I'm a little bit sympathetic with, was the idea that Western capitalist society was creating men who had not fully matured because they hadn't gone through, you know, this kind of anthropological, supposedly kind of ancient process um, of initiation into manhood, and that this needed to be kind of corrected and explored by this group of men. Some were kind of psychologists, some were therapists, some were poets like Robert Bly, who wrote, I think, probably the most famous text from this movement, which is Iron John. And yeah, they were, you know, I think at its best, and there's a lot to be said about it at its worst, but at its best, I think it was doing this kind of exploratory, um, figuring out, experimenting of new ways of doing, I
Hmm.
think, like masculine practices and rituals. And the idea, I think, yeah, Robert Bly would say was to kind of create men who were less, you know, kind of less violent, less patriarchal.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it's
You do a good
the,
job on that episode of sort of teasing out, that they're explicitly not anti-feminist, but they had a very
mm,
complicated relationship and a very kind of, I mean, they harkened back to some sort of imagined past, I guess, like all of these
yeah,
bizarre, like tribal rituals that they had imagined people were doing or something. It is very odd. Um,
it is. Yeah, it's one of these kind of funny things where there's like so many, you know, it's a men's movement. It's specifically trying to rehabilitate the idea of masculinity, and as you say, it's harkening back to an imagined past when things were just better, just generally. I mean, this is the recipe basically for a reactionary movement, and that's why there were, I think, undoubtedly quite like reactionary
mm,
elements to it. Um, but I mean, you know, Julian, my co-host on ManClan, has a different take on this to me. He's very dismissive of the whole thing. I think when I first came across it, it seemed absurd. It seemed silly. I had no time for it whatsoever. I think having gotten a bit older, having watched, I guess, the rise of figures like Andrew Tate appealing to, you know, teenage boys, schools having to do seminars on like, you know, why it's not okay to behave like Andrew Tate to girls in real life. I've become a bit more sympathetic to the idea that, you know, perhaps there is something missing in the way that we raise young men.
mm.
Um, and even if I don't particularly think that the myth poetic men's movement was on the right track, I think there I think there was a nugget of a good idea there.
Mm. I think like at its core, and the way I see a lot of these folks is like they really are responding to the disempowering nature of modernity and industrial capitalism. Like when they
Mm,
talk about men being like stunted or disempowered or like
mm,
disconnected, isolated, like all of this is true, right? So it's
yeah,
like they actually are responding to something that's happening to them structurally. But as you do a really good job in the podcast, whenever that comes up, you make really clear that when they're offered the opportunity to then reach for that structural explanation, which is staring them right in the face, they never take it, right? It's
yeah.
always individualized.
Mm,
So why do you think they never take it? Is it just because like we're leftists, so that's what we look for, and they just can't see it, or do they like really want to avoid it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a weird way, it kind of comes back to the whole model of these influences, which is that ultimately, if they start pointing to structural problems, it remains somewhat out of their audience's control. Do you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
Whereas kind of self-improvement, you are just simply not an alpha, simply not alpha enough. You know, it creates it means that the problem is something that the audience member can fix simply by watching more videos, by consuming more content. And you know, some of the things, I think some of the cleverer influencers actually will point out this model to their audience even as they're selling it. Do you
Mm,
know? So I think some of them who are, you know, a bit younger, a bit more au fait with kind of like ironic kind of play with their audiences, will often say, you know, you're not doing self-improvement right now. You're just watching a video of mine. You're making me rich. You know?
right.
So it's like this kind of, yeah, this play, this kind of ironic teasing their
Right.
audience.
Oh, they hate their audience. I feel like
Yeah.
that's part of their appeal because their audience hates themselves, right? I mean, maybe not. Maybe I'm
Mm.
psychoanalyzing too much here, but like some of these Tate videos where he's just like so objectionably like mean to his like most ardent followers is
Mm.
it strikes me as something I could never enjoy, but people seem to.
Yeah, I think people respect it as honest, do you know?
Mm,
I think people it encourages that parasocial relationship because it makes them feel like a, you know, if you think about your very closest friends, they're not nice to you all the time, right? They kind of actually bust your balls a bit and like take the piss
hmm
out of you. And um, I think that is something quite insidious that lots of these influencers have figured out. They don't actually have to be nice. Some of their audiences kind of like it a bit more when they're not.
mm.
It feels more real, even though it is just a strategy, as we're talking about.
hmm
Um, but I mean, having said that, sorry, going back to
No.
the structural problems. I mean, I keep on coming back to this, I guess, this understanding of push and pull when it comes to an internet which has just like infinite options, right? So what makes you stay on one page? What makes you keep returning to one site? What makes you keep on returning to one YouTuber that you like? Um, and I think there's all kinds of clever strategies that people will adopt. But I think one thing I noticed, and I actually noticed this during, this is going to be a real throwback uh, internet wise, but I noticed it during the Gamergate campaign, if you remember anything
hmm
about that, which for any of our audience who don't, I'll try and summarize very quickly, was it was a harassment campaign against um, feminist video game developers and journalists in the video game industry. But one thing I noticed about that campaign was how it actually utilized things that you often see in lots of, I guess, activist campaigns, which is you have this one big overarching goal, which by its nature can never be achieved.
hmm
But if you just have that one goal, then, you know, your audience will, and it's never ever achieved, your audience gets demoralized, they get depressed, they drop out. Um, so you have to have like lots of little wins along the way. And so with Gamergate, I sort of noticed this was like the overall goal was the total eradication of feminist perspectives in video game culture. It's obviously not going to happen. Like that's just not how that's not how these things work. But the little mini goals were stuff like, you know, everybody get together and you know, write letters to this advertiser or send mean tweets to this video game developer and things like this. These little kind of like stretch goals that like kept everyone busy,
Right.
kept everyone entertained. And I sometimes think that's a kind of mechanism that works in, I guess, the anti-feminist internet more generally. You know, the overall arching stretch goal often is, you know, putting women back in their place, essentially. they're returning to a kind of pre-feminist model with none of the kind of social strictures of a pre-feminist model that were actually pretty unhelpful to men as well. Um, kind of returning to this sort of fantasy of masculine empowerment
Mm.
on a societal level. But you're never going to get that right. You can't just undo feminism that way. So you kind of have to have these little goals, little stretch goals, which kind of encourage you that, like, generally you are winning.
Mm. Right. That makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask you about sort of a question about you as a journalist and reporter, wading into this kind of world. Like for me, I feel that one of the things that frustrates me sometimes when we talk about like really odious political manifestations is we just dismiss them as odious political manifestations.
Mm,
So misogynists are misogynists. It's like, okay, sort of like tautological. And I guess what I
yeah.
do is I'm trying to think of it as like a kind of intellectual curiosity almost. But like
Mm.
for me, like a white cis hetero guy to be like, okay, they're an intellectual curiosity. It's like they're not attacking me. So I wanted to ask you about that, like wading into a world like this. How do you, how do you go about doing that, and how do you maintain a sense of yourself, but also like navigate, the level of like you need to do the condemnation, but also the understanding. How did you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's two different strands of that. So I guess I'll just go with the like condemnation thing first. Um, it's difficult, I think, when you get very used to this world to bear in mind that lots of the stuff that you are repeating and relaying is actually kind of horrific
Mm-hmm.
because you do just get desensitized to it, you know? And that can be a challenge for me. I think definitely one thing that really changed when I started doing this kind of research is it changed my sense of humor. I guess a bit like, anybody who kind of works in a field that's like a bit dark or something, you develop a bit of a dark sense of humor about it.
Mm.
And I think this is normal, especially I think if you're a woman who is, reading lots of, uh, you know, misogynist, racist, homophobic kind of stuff every day. So sometimes I've really bombed, I think, sometimes at lectures and academic conferences where I forget my audience and I forget that the imagery that I am showing them is actually kind of horrific,
Right.
and that I need to bear in mind that this is not an audience who is familiar with this kind of content as I am. So yeah, it definitely does, I think, change you, but in a weird way. I think there's some, even if it means you make more social faux pas, as I do. I think in a weird way it's quite helpful, because I think probably the worst way that you can report this stuff or write about this stuff, which I think you're picking up on too, is just shock horror. Look
Right.
how hideous this is. Do you know? Because then what are you really achieving in that sense? Just pointing out that somebody said something horrible on the internet is not actually helpful. In lots of ways, it's almost exactly the response they want, because they
Mm-hmm.
like this sense of themselves as being, kind of shocking and repulsive to the snowflake mainstream media. So you don't actually want to fall into that trap, I think, of just uh, of being horrified by something simply because it is horrifying. Do
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Because then uh, you don't know why it's happening. Like, why is it
Mm,
recurring, and what would it mean to respond to it?
yeah.
So, like, why is it happening? Obviously, that's a really big question. I mean, as I put it on Twitter the other day, I tagged you, so I'm sure you saw it. Like, for me, the question is like, what makes this such a potent space at this particular like historical juncture? Like, like, is it purely a sort of social media phenomenon? Are there some underlying structural things that are mounting at this particular moment? It's probably a combination of a bunch of things. But like, what is your sort of what's the show's prevailing theory as to why this is so popular suddenly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that I obviously think about a lot. Uh, My answer, I think, does change. Yeah, I've got an answer, but I think it's still quite fluid.
Hmm.
Generally, I'd kind of try to point to the things outside the internet, I think, that I think, create this need or this desire for this kind of content. Because it's really easy just to point at the internet and say it's fucked everything up, you know. But in a weird way, I think that's also quite handy because I think it removes responsibility from a lot of people who um, are quite powerful and have kind of created this sort of social settlement that we find ourselves in. And I'm more than happy just to point to Silicon Valley venture capitalism and say, they've been really irresponsible with our society. But I sort of think, yeah, Silicon Valley venture capitalists obviously have been irresponsible with our society, but they weren't the ones who were elected to be responsible with it, do you know?
Hmm.
So, I point to, I think, things particularly for young people, which um, have been proven, I think, historically to create, even before the internet existed, to kind of create a demand for, I guess, more radical politics. So, yeah, things like economic depression, economic crashes, rising cost of living, um, yeah, the kind of depression, apathy about the future. All of these things, I think, are also really important um, in terms of creating a market, in terms of creating a
Hmm.
desire for this kind of content.
Mm. The precarity that young people face, I feel like that's such an overriding element of this, where it's like, these influencers are telling you like how you need to take care of yourself because
Mm.
no one else will do it. And like, that's true. Like, no one else is
Yeah.
taking care of these young people. So I think it the kind of really kind of vicious dog eat dog world they reflect, it's sort of like the id or whatever, but it
Mm.
is it is kind of the world that we live in a way. It's a monstrous manifestation of it, but I think for a lot of people it feels real because it is real, probably.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I should add an important caveat because, of course, whenever you say this, somebody will say, well, actually, the people who are drawn to these social spaces, to these influences, tend to be the least economically precarious groups. And I think that is important to point out. Um, it's obviously really hard to actually get a sense of
Hmm.
demographically who is watching this, who is watching Andrew Tate, and but I guess on the previous generation of manosphere, on forums where people could more reliably submit data like this, I think that generally bared out. Like it tended to be uh, white men
Hmm.
with a degree, with a university degree. Um, but I think this can kind of misunderstand what we're talking about when, yeah, the term economic anxiety almost became a meme, I think, at one
Yeah.
point. But economic anxiety doesn't actually straightforwardly mean you are poor or you
Right.
are in poverty. Um, it's actually kind of it's a kind of more complicated feeling about the fear of losing status or the fear of kind of, slipping down a rung in the economic ladder, which I think is actually probably going to affect people from a middle class, college educated background
Right.
more.
Right.
So I think that is alongside the fact that these places are incredibly off-putting to anyone who is not white and male. I think that does tend to be why they are drawn to,
Hmm.
I guess, not just manosphere politics, but radical right politics
Right.
in general.
The kind of dashed expectations that's just as potent. I think that's
Mm.
its point is really well taken. Um, so how do we talk to them and maybe de-radicalize them, or maybe if that's not doable or if that's too difficult, stop other people from that may have sympathies from going down this kind of rabbit hole? Because when we discussed earlier offline, you told me something that I've been thinking about ever since, or you said, well, the people that I've met that left the manosphere are mostly communists.
Yeah.
and that has left me with such optimism. um, like, tell me more about that.
Yeah. So I guess this was the other half of your question, which I forgot to answer earlier, where you sort of said, what's it like being a journalist and entering this world. And particularly when I was writing very high profile pieces about the alt-right and stuff, that drew me a huge amount of attention. Much of it very bad, much of it pretty ugly. But one thing that it did eh, give me, which I am really grateful for, was I think more attention from people who were either in the manosphere or the alt-right or exiting those spaces. And I think were curious, were flattered, were intrigued by the fact that an academic was looking at these spaces and struck up conversation with me. Um, and I mean, there's two data points which I really want to be very clear. This was not a scientifically gathered sample. This was literally just the people who DM'd me on Twitter. So you can't draw any conclusions from it. But yes, nearly all the people who had exited those spaces, I would say, had swung very far left, if not outright communist, socialist, or I guess in America they call them Bernie Bros. Um, and yeah, quite a lot of them, when I was talking to them about, what made them change their mind. I mean, most people's stories didn't really have a neat realization. There's not kind of you sort of hope for that kind of wonderful road to Damascus moment of, and then my worldview shattered and crumbled all around me. But most people, it was a bit slower. They gradually just found it a bit more annoying, a bit more they became a bit more disenchanted, and they started seeking other perspectives. Quite a lot of them had a relationship of some kind, I think, with a woman. And I want to be really clear, I don't mean like a sexual relationship necessarily. I think one or two people I spoke to, it was actually online friendships with a woman. That I think, yeah, I guess again, just once again, probably began just like complicating that, that incredibly black and white worldview when it comes to relationships between the genders, to interactions between the genders and the power differentials and stuff, which is like all incredibly, you're either being, dominated or you're submissive. You're either winning or you're losing, which of course isn't really how most relationships work, do you know? Um, so that was another data point, a commonality that I noticed. But I want to be really clear. I always have to do this when I say this. I am not suggesting to women out there, go and hug your local incel, like when you're the key. I think it's much more complicated than that. But I think the research that has been borne out on these kind of de-radicalization journeys is that it often does take a relationship with somebody who cares about them.
Mm-hmm.
Male, female, anybody, do you know? That is, I think, probably one of the biggest features, essentially, and somebody stepping out from that space. But yeah, no, I mean, I brought up the how many of them would turn communist thing, because you said, does the left need to be doing more?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that being my one unscientifically gathered data point kind of makes me think a bit like maybe the left are the only people who,
right,
other than these predatory manosphere grifters, who are, I wonder if maybe acknowledging the central malaise, the central complaint that kind of lies at the heart of this kind of discontent, rather than, I think, a very unsatisfying message, which I think you can often get from maybe like more moderate politicians, which simply sort of says, like everything's basically fine. Sure, it needs tinkering here and there, but things are basically fine. And, if you don't feel fine with this settlement, something must be wrong with you.
Right, absolutely. And then that these people are just like some kind of pathological aberration that ought to be like scolded and censored rather than being like an outgrowth of the corrupt system that we live in. I think you're totally right that like the left is probably the only people, the left and the far right is the only people that are actually like trying something here. So yeah, the other thing I was thinking about is just like how kind of like I was saying earlier about how the structural kind of explanation is often hitting them like right in the head. Like it seems like it's not that far a step for some of these people if they're just like pushed in the right direction intellectually. Just to put one kind of example on it, when you talk about The End of Men, the Tucker Carlson documentary, he has this whole section about how this like unregulated chemical runoff is creating these deleterious health effects. And there's like some truth to this science, but then that's spun into kind of like, well, it's demasculating men and we need to recover our masculinity through like working out together. But it could just as easily be spun into, yeah, we are totally like disempowered in late stage capitalism, and the problem is that we need to like rein in these corporate behemoths that don't care about us. It just seems like a little gentle nudge.
I mean, yeah, that was, to use a British phrase, I don't maybe use this in Canada as well, actually. It was really cheeky, I
Yeah.
thought, like to make an entire documentary about, yeah, about environmental catastrophe
Yeah.
in the United States, and then to say this is the left's fault, this is the soy globalist fault, and they're doing it deliberately because they hate masculine men, as opposed to, I think, just decades and decades of just ruthless deregulation at the hands of the party that Tucker Carlson is like a flagship for.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know? I mean, just unbelievable cheek, really. But I mean, but also I think quite concerning, because I think Carlson has distinguished himself with a couple of other Fox News anchors. I think Ingraham tries to do the same thing, but maybe not quite as well. In I think keeping, always trying to keep a pace of the next trend of the right wing, not just simply marketing themselves to Fox News's target audience of kind of American white pensioners, but sort of trying to keep ahead of the trend of what's going to be the latest tendency emerging on the American right. So I think he's worth paying attention to in that regard. And I think it's quite interesting, this environmental far right trend, because people still seem very perplexed by it. But, just as we got all of the QAnon hippies, these aesthetics and politics can actually combine really nicely, particularly if those aesthetics just happened to be on the left due to, general historical and sociological accident. But they can just as easily come and be repurposed to the right, And I think that's kind of what's happening with this new conservative environmentalism, which has absolutely no interest in global warming, or climate change, or anything that requires an international global solution. But it's incredibly interested in the idea that you personally are being poisoned by the water that you drink and the food that you eat, and in some cases like touching receipts and things like this. This is all really, really interesting to them, and it's very insidious because it can sound like ordinary environmental concerns that have been brought up by green groups for years, but it's almost what they're not saying, and it's almost what they're pointing their audiences away from, that makes it so insidious.
Absolutely. And what their solution is, rather than
Mm.
any kind of policy oriented shift in our economy. It's like buy these supplements and do this bro science. Um,
Yeah, that's the solution, right? It's
yeah.
just, watch what you eat and go to the gym. I mean, the theory that was put forward in the documentary was, well, because then you'll be a big, strong man and you can finally overthrow the government. I thought, if you if you're spending 6 hours a day in the gym, there's no way you're overthrowing the
Yeah.
government. Do you think that's what Trotsky and Lenin were doing back?
It's so psychologically enticing, though, because if you do the program, I'm sure you're going to see some results because to
Yeah.
a certain extent, you can control to a certain extent what you eat and how you exercise and who you exercise with. But we have very little control over policymakers, corporate elites,
Mm.
and trying that is just, I mean, this is the story of the left. It's like it's all about our futility and our struggle and like maintaining
Mm.
hope in the face of that. This offer though is just like much more psychologically appealing. It's like, sure,
Mm.
I can get jacked. I can see results. I get why they do it. It makes a lot of sense. Um, I wanted to ask you a little bit. I know we're kind of running short on time, and do you have like 10 more minutes? Can I
Yeah,
ask
of
you a bit?
course.
Okay, fantastic. I do have a meeting at the top of the hour, um, but your most recent episode is about Barbara Ehrenreich, and her book came out in the 80s, I think, called The Hearts of Men, um, which is fascinating. I hadn't heard of it until you mentioned it, and I read it. And for people who don't know, just to give like a little like, brief encapsulation, Barbara Ehrenreich is like, for my money, one of the like best journalists of the past generation. She's known for the book Nickel and Dimed, which was like a kind of undercover expose of what it was like to live and try and get by in low wage work, and try being the operative word there, but also like quite interesting theorist. She was, and her partner came up with the term the PMC, and written a lot about sort of like middle class mores and the anxieties of the professional managerial class. Anyway, so in the 80s, before even that, she writes a book called The Hearts of Men, which probably isn't that surprising because she really is a titan of like the feminist health movement,
Mm.
especially. But this is not about feminism, really. It's about like a male backlash. Um, so can you tell me a little bit about why this book for this series? What made you want to look at it?
Well, it was partly my way of making up to Julian for making him read Iron John, which he hated, but I did insist was very important to understand the influences that we were looking at. So in a way, I was just like, all right, I'm going to also give you a good book, some good reading. Um, but no, I mean, I think I found it such an intriguing read, the book, because it contextualizes, I think, the new mode of masculinity emerging in the 80s, and but it contextualizes it, I think, in not just simply in relationship to women and the feminist movement, but also I think to the wider economic backdrop, essentially, that the kind of old contracts of masculine endeavor, of commitment, of um, I totally blanked on the
the
word.
uh, the the
Of
breadwinner role, right?
the breadwinner role,
Yeah.
yeah, were essentially being torn up, not just by the feminist movement, which is, often what people zero in on, but also by companies and corporations themselves. You used to be essentially in the kind of, yeah, post-war settlement. You were a company man. You went and you worked at a job and you stayed there for the rest of your life. And more increasingly, with the rise of neoliberal economics, this was being made to be a completely foolish endeavor. Um, so Ehrenreich kind of picks up this kind of, yeah, what she calls the kind of flight from commitment, this I guess, this emergent playboy archetype, which you literally see with like people like Hugh Hefner and things like that. But I think, yeah, it becomes more normalized and everyday in things like men's magazines, but also the stuff that I was talking about at the very start of the episode, the kind of seduction, picking up chicks. Because the idea is essentially that commitment is kind of no longer a masculine virtue, but it actually kind of makes you a bit of a sucker.
Right.
You know? And this isn't just women, it's not just because women are gaining their own economic power and leaving the home, although this is obviously part of it. But it's, yeah, I think she contextualizes it as part of a wider economic backdrop. And I think I find that a really intriguing principle. And yeah, the book was received very mixed reviews when it came out. I think there were like some feminist academics who described it as anti-feminist. But I disagree. I think it's, yeah, I think it's a really important piece of scholarship, of polemic. And it's, yeah, something that I guess it's an approach I try to take to my own work on, yeah, masculinity in the contemporary era.
That's interesting that people would interpret it as anti-feminist. I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, there is a way, like, if you don't read the conclusion of it, where, like, one can think, okay, is she trying to say, like, this post-war compact of, like, the family wage and the dependent, like, mother and wife is better than what we have now? And she does talk about, like, the feminization of poverty because, like, men flee from commitment. But she also concludes, like, that neither role is what we want. We shouldn't try to go back to that, and we should have like a universal, like, and robust welfare system that like empowers us all to not just play a particular type of role.
Precisely. I mean, I think that's exactly it. She's painting an idea of the kind of previous archetype of masculinity, the post-war archetype, as you know, she's showing how it is perceived by people who kind of hold that value highly, right? So she's writing about it in kind of like elevated terms to show you how they see it from their perspective. And I think people misinterpreted that as her romanticizing that like previous gender settlement, as opposed to just, yeah, I think just showing what it looked like from the perspective of someone who sees it as a virtue, and then contrasting it with contemporary, well, and at her point, contemporary masculinity.
Right. Just like, what are the effects of that? Like, if men, I mean, she says in the conclusion, like, men liberated themselves first, essentially, right? And like that creates like some real like deleterious economic consequences for women who are still making less or have nothing. Yeah, I thought, you know, one of the feelings I had reading it, especially the early parts, is like such quaint concerns that like post-war liberals had. So it opens, I think, really kind of like the inciting kind of moment is what she describes as like a kind of a sociological panic over conformity and affluence, like the organization man, the bureaucracy that like is providing people a house in the suburbs, the 2-car garage and the white picket fence and everything is like stifling. And sure, culturally it is very stifling, but thinking about it now, it's like, wow, like that's a problem of affluence. How quaint for them to be so concerned.
I mean, I think you don't even have to go that far back. I mean, something I found really amusing online is people bringing up how in the kind of Gen X slacker movie, the like worst thing that the protagonist can imagine is like just working in like an office job for the rest of his life. And now you've got like millennials and Gen Z being like, man, an office job for the rest of your life? Are you joking? Like,
one of the questions I had reading it is like sort of the cause and effect, or like the order of sequences, because like there's one way to read the male rebellion as like purely self-interest, where it's like they realize that like, why would I support a family? I can just have a playboy lifestyle. And then there's another way to read it as like, it's probably both, but the other way to read it would be that like that lifestyle is no longer really even feasible. So then the Playboy lifestyle is a kind of like compensatory luxury. It's like, I can't afford a house in the suburbs. I can afford an apartment and make really nice cocktails, right? Like, so I don't know. How do you see it? Because that it's kind of a moral question, right? Like, did they fly from commitment out of their pure self-interest, or was that that reality just not an option anymore, and then therefore they idolized the alternative? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the push-pull effect, like yet again, like um it certainly seems quite unlikely to me that men en masse would suddenly wake up and be like, I don't want this anymore. I
Right.
want this lifestyle instead. Like it doesn't really fit into like I guess how we look at social trends historically, and it's always so much easier to understand it when it's like 150 years ago, right? Um, but yeah, so I think there's an element of both. But I think generally, yeah, it becomes less and less feasible to live up to the previous ideal of masculinity. And so, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep chasing that even though it gets harder and harder? Or are you going to get attracted by the kind of hot new trend that actually
Right.
seems much more livable, much more doable from your perspective?
So what was the verdict between you and Julian? Do you think that the book helped you understand like people like Tate and his followers?
I mean, I think it certainly helps me to understand. I guess Playboy is another one of these phrases which is very outdated, much like manosphere. And yet I think is actually a really useful historical archetype to kind of that you can watch evolve, like from right from the Hugh Hefner days to right to now to these guys on YouTube. Um, but I couldn't tell you Julian's verdict because we were meant to record our episode
Oh,
yesterday and had to reschedule. So I
can't
can only speak for myself.
can't wait to hear it. Um, well, Annie Kelly, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
This has been a great chat. Thanks so much for having me.